Hey guys, it's Sean from the Modest Wallet. So, ibonds or tips, what's the better hedge against inflation?
I do not know.
Keep watching and you'll soon find out. By the end of this video, you will know the basics of ibonds and tips, some pros and cons of each, as well as how to decide on whether to buy ibonds or to buy tips.
Great, I'm ready to learn.
ibonds stands for inflation-linked savings bonds, and TIPS stands for Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. Both are bonds and hedge against inflation, but there are some essential similarities and differences between ibonds and TIPS.
But they're both.
One thing that they both have in common is that they both want you to smash that subscribe button.
You can do it!
No, really, they do want you to do that. Go ahead, it doesn't cost you anything and really helps me out. Anyway, let's first talk about some ibond basics. Ibonds are treasury bonds that pay a fixed rate of interest as well as another layer of interest that varies with the current inflation rate as measured by the Consumer Price Index. ibonds are available only to individuals. That's why there are no ibond funds, and they're available with face values as low as $25 directly from the US Treasury. ibonds reach their final maturity 30 years after they are issued, but investors can cash them in 12 months after purchase without penalty.
No penalty, no penalty.
If you redeem an ibond within 5 years of buying it, however, you'll forfeit 3 months worth of interest. ibonds don't pay you income while you own the bond. Rather, the interest accrues and gets paid out when you sell or the bond matures. Now let's get into some pros or reasons why you might consider ibonds. First are the high real yields. Now, these arguably are the safest inflation-adjusted yield available today, and they are the key attraction to ibonds. Second, ibonds don't make regular interest payments, so holders aren't on the hook, for any taxes until they sell or the ibond matures.
To grow up.
Third, when you cash your ibonds in after they mature or you sell, you'll owe federal tax but no state or local taxes. Finally, using ibonds for higher education expenses exempts you from state and local taxes. Let's discuss the cons. When it comes to ibond cons, the major concern are the purchase restraints. You are only allowed $10,000 per social security number, with an additional $5,000 if you use your own tax return. Secondly, because ibonds don't make regular interest payments but instead pay your income when you sell, they're not a good option for those looking to fund any part of their living expenses with the current interest from the bonds. Now let's talk about tips. Like ibonds, tips include an element of inflation protection. An important thing to note is that TIPS principal values are adjusted to incorporate the current inflation rate, whereas ibonds receive an adjustment in their interest rates to reflect inflation. TIPS interest payments also vary with the CPI, but indirectly. When investors' principal values are adjusted for inflation, their interest payments will also adjust. Both individuals and other institutions, such as mutual funds, can buy TIPS. They're sold in $100 increments and are only available in electronic form. TIPS carry terms of 5, 10, and 30 years. But in contrast with ibonds, which don't change hands in the secondary market, you can sell a TIPS bond to another investor through a broker.
A broker, really?
You can buy TIPS directly from the government at treasurydirect.gov, or you can buy individual TIPS bonds through your brokerage firm. You can also buy a mutual fund or ETF dedicated to TIPS. Let's examine a few pros of TIPS. Individual investors face virtually no purchase constraints. The upper limit on TIPS purchases turns into the millions. Secondly, TIPS sell on the secondary market as well as the availability of TIPS mutual funds. Third, the fact that you can sell TIPS to other investors also allows you to capitalize on price changes in the bonds. Finally, TIPS bonds make regular, semi-annual interest payments, making TIPS preferable for those seeking current income. When it comes to cons with TIPS, the major disadvantage is related to taxes. TIPS investors pay tax on their income payments as well as the inflation adjustment made to their principal. Because of that, a tax-sheltered account like an IRA or a 401k is preferred over a taxable account. Investors who invest in TIPS bonds by buying a mutual fund could lose money over their holding periods. TIPS bonds trade on the open market and can be quite volatile, especially over shorter time periods.
Short-term gig.
Now that I've discussed some important pros and cons of each, ibonds and TIPS, I want to talk about deciding between them. Both offer principal protection and purchasing power protection, as well as built-in features to combat rising inflation risks, just in different ways. When deciding between the two, you want to look at purchasing caps.
They're caps. Nothing but caps.
According to the treasurydirect.gov site, the total value of electronic ibonds you can buy in a single calendar year is capped at $10,000 per person, with an additional $5,000 in paper bonds if you direct your tax refund toward the purchase of bonds. There's a $25 minimum purchase for each bond, and you can purchase down to the penny, so I could purchase $25.36 worth if I really wanted to. With TIPS, you can buy up to $5 million at any single auction using Treasury Direct. The minimum for TIPS is $100. Now let's briefly discuss the terms of ownership. TIPS have no minimum term of ownership. You can sell them on the secondary market at any time. You can't sell ibonds until 12 months after you purchase them, and you'll forfeit 3 months of interest if you redeem them before you've owned them for 5 years. When it comes to tax treatment, interest and any increase in principal from inflation adjustments are taxed each year when you buy TIPS. You can be taxed on income you haven't received yet because you don't receive an increase in the principal of the bond until you sell it. Interest is added to the value of an ibond and only taxed upon redemption. This feature may make it more tax efficient to own TIPS in tax-deferred retirement accounts, depending on the state you live in and your tax bracket. While TIPS are subject to federal taxes, they are exempt from state and local taxes. Please consult with a qualified tax professional to determine whether this strategy will work in your particular situation. Let's look at the performance during a deflationary environment. TIPS can go down in value in a deflationary environment, but they'll always be worth at least the original principal amount at redemption. ibonds can never go down below the bond's value in the prior month. Any upward inflation adjustments you've received can't be eroded by a period of late occurring deflation. Availability is key, so let's briefly discuss available terms. TIPS are issued in 5, 10, and 30-year terms. ibonds pay interest for 30 years. You can redeem them after 12 months, but if you do prior to 5 years, you'll forfeit the last 3 months of interest. ibonds rates are adjusted each May and November. The total rate is the sum of the fixed rate and the variable inflation indexed rate. TIPS principal is adjusted by changes in the consumer price index, either going up or down. The interest rate is determined at issue. The dollar amount paid will depend on the principal value of the bond, so a higher amount of interest will be paid out if the principal is adjusted upward based on increases in inflation.
Stick with bacon.
The variable portion of an ibond's interest rate is set every 6 months. It's based on the consumer price index. This variable rate is paid out in addition to a fixed rate that is determined when the bond is issued. Where can you buy TIPS and ibonds? TIPS can be purchased online through Treasury Direct or from a bank or broker. You can use a non-competitive bid and take the market yield. If you go through a bank, broker, or dealer, you can make a competitive bid to specify your desired rate. However, with the competitive bid, you might not get the investment or amount you want due to your entered competitive price. ibonds are available online through Treasury Direct or in paper form using your federal tax income refund.
Great talk.
That was a ton of information. It is great that you are considering the difference between the two because it can be tricky to distinguish between the two options. If you did find value, please smash that like button on this video. If you have any further questions, I would be more than happy to do my best to answer them. Otherwise, seek the advice of a professional licensed financial advisor. Thanks so much for checking out our video and channel. I'll see you in the next video.